Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to the Gentleman Psychic. I did not have a chance to actually set my angles properly, so it looks a little off, but that's okay. Um, Sorry, my moustache is a little bit not as curly as usual. Um, I have to do all of the social media things, so just a second. You know how that goes. Um, where am I? Library, your videos. Come on, part 8. Show me part 8. I am live. One person is watching. It might be me. I don't know. Live. Okay, let's see. Share. Copy link. We'll go over here. We'll post it here. Paste that. And then we'll do, hi, John. Good evening. Scotty Dahadi. Good evening. Hello, everybody. Let me just do the medias of social, as I like to say. I don't have Ustream, but it would probably make sense if I did. Okay. Join me live for story time. And we post that one, and then we'll go right over. Hello there, Mary Jane. Hello, Malika. Hello, Connor. I'm so glad that I can help. Hello, Nate Mack. Hello, I'm doing well. Stephen, hello. I just have one more medias of social to post to. Let's see. I'm actually thrilled that I was able to do this live for story time because I said that I was put in Facebook jail. So, hello, sir. I hope you're doing well. Doing very well. Great podcast today with Wilder Sebastian. Thank you very much. Hello, Christy. Good to see you. So I wanted to talk before we go into story time. And forgive me, I did not adjust my lights. Ooh, that's worse. I didn't have time to really adjust anything. That's not good either. That's better. Okay. So I was thrown in Facebook jail by the Facebook police. There is, out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, there is a public wedding venue that took it upon themselves as a public wedding venue to say no members of the LGBTQ, because we are a Christian company. And so you can go other places, but you can't come here. Meanwhile, touting how great and wonderful their business is. And so when I discovered that these people were discriminatory against a population of the United States and a population of people, I took it upon myself to tell them exactly what biblical marriage entails. And I went on a list of these are biblical marriages: a man, a woman, a man, a woman, her sister, her maid. It was a long thing that I did. And they said that I was bullying. And I had tried to report their post. I had tried to report their business. And of course, Facebook came back and said that they did not violate Facebook terms. But meanwhile, I was put in Facebook jail for 2 days. But I'm back, and I posted before we came on here. And who saw the supermoon this week? That's what Scotty is asking. There is our clock telling us it is, of course, the hour for reading. Isn't that lovely? How charming. Charming. Anyway, I think without further ado, my lovelies, enough of the venting, enough of that, and I welcome you now. We are going to continue reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Without further ado, part 2. Oh, before I start, I have the fan on down here because last week I was a little bit warm. Does the sound? I can't even talk. Does the sound of the fan disrupt any of you? You can tell me here in the comments before we go. I don't see any negative. I don't see any. I don't. No one says that it bothers them. So if it does not, perfect. Oh, thank you very much. Good. Thank you very much. So we have 3 no's, and that is perfectly fine. Will Scared and Alone be returning anytime soon? Yes. So before we go into that, into 20,000 Leagues, Scared and Alone we were on hiatus for a little while, and we are going to be picking back up hopefully within the next couple of weeks. I hope so. But yes, we are planning on doing that. I'm doing that. I'm doing very well. Thank you, Yesha. Good to see you. I'm really excited. I actually have some other things in the works too that I can't talk about just yet. It's just not time. But when it does become time, I will let each and every one of you know, and I'll be proud to share good news. But right now, I just have to sort of tell you, Scared and Alone is coming back and in a couple of weeks. I'm not entirely certain when, but yes, it is coming back. And I guess good. I'm glad you can't wait. It's a fun show. I really enjoy it. My co-hosts are brilliant. I enjoy them too. But tonight you have me, and I am your only host, and we are going to continue reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But first, I should go ahead and wet my whistle, as they say. It is important to be lubricated. Are the boys nearby for story time? You know, my boys are upstairs. I really should. I miss them. They miss performing. So hello, Amanda. Good to see you. My boys will be making more appearances soon. It's been a while, but they will be returning too. All right. Now, without further ado, my loves, part 2 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Chapter 1. The Indian Ocean. We now come to the second part of our journey, under the sea. The first ended with the moving scene in the coral cemetery, which left such a deep impression on my mind. Thus, in the midst of this great sea, Captain Nemo's life was passing even to his grave, which he had prepared in one of its deepest abysses. There, not one of the ocean's monsters could trouble the last sleep of the crew of the Nautilus, of those friends riveted to each other in death as in life, nor any man either. Had added the captain, still the same fierce, impeccable, defiant toward human society. I could no longer content myself with a hypothesis which satisfied counsel. The worthy fellow persisted in seeing in the commander of the Nautilus one of those unknown savants who return mankind contempt for indifference. For him, he was a misunderstood genius who, tired of Earth's deceptions, had taken refuge in this inaccessible medium, where he might follow his instincts freely. To my mind, this hypothesis explained but one side of Captain Nemo's character. Indeed, the mystery of that last night during which we had been chained in prison, the sleep, and the precaution so violently taken by the captain of snatching from my hand the eyeglass I had raised to sweep the horizon, the mortal wound of man due to an unaccountable shock of the Nautilus, all put me on a new track. No, Captain Nemo was not satisfied with shunning man. His formidable apparatus not only suited his instinct of freedom, but perhaps also the design of some terrible retaliation. At this moment, nothing is clear to me. I catch but a glimpse of light amid all the darkness, and I must confine myself to writing as events shall dictate. That day, the 24th of January, 1868, at noon, the second officer came to take the altitude of the sun. I mounted the platform, lit a cigar, and watched the operation. It seemed to me that the man did not understand French, for several times I made remarks in a loud voice, which must have drawn them from him some involuntary sign of attention, if he had understood them, but he remained undisturbed and dumb. Pardon me. As he was taking observations with the sextant, one of the sailors of the Nautilus, the strong man who had accompanied us on our first submarine excursion to the island of Crespo, came to clean the glasses of the lantern. I examined the fittings of the apparatus, the strength of which was increased 100-fold by lenticule rings placed similar to those in a lighthouse, and which projected their brilliance in a horizontal plane. The electric lamp was combined in such a way to give it most powerful light. Indeed, it was produced in vacuo, which ensured both its steadiness and its intensity. This vacuum economized the graphite points between which the luminous arc was developed, an important point of economy for Captain Nemo, who could not easily have replaced them, and under these conditions their waste was imperceptible. When the Nautilus was ready to continue its submarine journey, I went down to the saloon. The panels were closed, and the course marked direct west. We were furrowing the waters of the Indian Ocean, a vast liquid plain with a surface of 1,200,000 of acres, of whose waters are so clear and transparent that anyone leaning over them would turn giddy. The Nautilus usually floated between 50 and 100 fathoms deep. We went on so for some days. To anyone but myself, who had a great love of the sea, the hours would have seemed long and monotonous. But the daily walks on the platform, when I steeped myself in the reviving air of the ocean, the sight of the rich waters, through the windows of the saloon, the books in the library, the compiling of my memoirs took up all my time and left me not a moment of ennui or weariness. For some days we saw a great number of aquatic birds, seamews or gulls. Some were cleverly killed and prepared in a certain way, made very acceptable water game among large winged birds, carried a long distance from all lands, and resting upon the waves from the fatigue of their flight. I saw some magnificent albatross uttering discordant cries like the braying of an ass. The birds belonging to the family of the longing, longipennates, the family of the totempalamates, was represented by the sea swallows, which caught the fish from the surface, and by numerous phaetons or lepturae, among others, the phaeton with the red lines as large as a pigeon, whose white plumage tinted with pink shows off to advantage the blackness of its wings. As to the fish, they always provoked our admiration when we surprised the secrets of their aquatic life through the open panels. I saw many kinds which I never before had a chance of observing. I shall notice chiefly ostrataceans peculiar to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and that part which washes the coast of the tropical America. These fishes, like the tortoise, the armadillo, the sea hedgehog, and the crustacea, are protected by a breastplate, which is neither chalky nor stony, but real bone. In some, it takes the form of a solid triangle, in others, a solid quadrangle. Among the triangular, I saw some 1.5 inches in length, with wholesome flesh and delicious flavor. They are brown at the tail and yellow at the fins, and I recommended their introduction into fresh water, to which a certain number of sea fish easily accustom themselves. I would also mention quadrangular ostrataceans, having on the back 4 large tubercles, some dotted over with white spots on the lower part of the body, and which may be tamed like birds. Trigons provided with spikes formed by the lengthening of their bony shell, and which, from their strange gruntings, are called sea pigs. Also, dromedaries with large humps in the shape of a cone, whose flesh is very tough and leathery. I now borrow from the daily notes of Master Council certain fish of the guests of genus Petrodron peculiar to those seas, with red backs and white chests, and are distinguished by 3 rows of longitudinal filaments, and some electrical 7 inches long, decked in liveliest colors. Then, as specimens of other kinds, some ovoids, resembling an egg of dark brown color, marked with white bands and without tails, diodons, real sea porcupines, furnished with spikes and cable of swelling in such way as to look like cushions bristling with darts, hippocampi, common to every ocean from the Pegasi, with lengthened snouts, which their pectoral fins, being much elongated and formed in the shape of wings, allow, if not to fly, at least to shoot into the air. Pigeons, spatulae with tails covered with many rings of shell, macroganthae with long jaws, an excellent fish 9 inches long and bright with the most agreeable colors, pale-colored calamores with rugged heads, and plenty of cathodons with long and tubular muzzles, which kill insects by shooting them from an air gun with a single drop of water. These we may call the flycatchers of the sea. In the 89th genus of fishes, classed by Lacépédiae, belonging to the second lower class of bony, characterized by opercules and bronchial membranes, I remarked the Soprianii, the head of which is furnished with spikes, and which has but 1 dorsal fin. The creatures are covered or not with little shells according to the subclass to which they belong. The second subclass gives us specimens of diatictiles 14 or 15 inches high in length, with yellow rays and heads of most fantastic appearance. As to the first subclass, it gives several specimens of that singular-looking fish, appropriately called sea frog, with large head, sometimes swollen with protuberances, bristling with spikes and covered with tubercules. It's very wordy. Tubercules. It has irregular and hideous horns. Its body and tail are covered with calicites. Its sting makes a dangerous wound. It is both repugnant and horrible to look at. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, the Nautilus went at the rate of 250 leagues in 24 hours, being 540 miles or 22 miles an hour. If we recognize so many different varieties of fish, it was because, attracted by the electric light, they tried to follow us. The greater part, however, were soon distanced by our speed, though some kept their pace in the waters of the Nautilus for a time. The morning of the 24th, in 12 degrees 5 south latitude and 94 degrees 33 longitude, we observed Keeling Island, a madrepore formation planted with magnificent cocoas, and which had been visited by Mr. Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. The Nautilus skirted the shores of the desert island for a little distance. Its nets brought up numerous specimens of polypi and curious shells of mollusks. Some precious productions of the species of the Delphinuli enriched the treasures of Captain Nemo, to which I added an Astrea pontificaria, a kind of parasite polypus, often found fixed to a shell. Soon, Keeling Island disappeared from the horizon, and our course was directed to the northwest in the direction of the Indian Peninsula. From Keeling Island, our course was slower and more variable, often taking us into great depths. Several times they made us of the inclined planes which certain internal levers placed obliquely at the waterline. In that way, we went about 2 miles, but without ever obtaining the greatest depths of the Indian Sea, which surroundings of 7,000 fathoms have never reached. As to the temperature of the lower strata, the thermometer invariably indicated 4 degrees above zero. I only observed that, in the upper regions, the water was always colder in the high levels than at the surface of the sea. On the 25th of January, the ocean was entirely deserted. The Nautilus passed the day on the surface, beating the waves with its powerful screw, and making them rebound to great height. Who under such circumstances, would not have taken it for a gigantic cetacean? 3 parts of this day I spent on the platform. I watched the sea. Nothing on the horizon, till about 4 o'clock, a steamer running west on our counter. Her masts were visible for an instant, but she could not see the Nautilus, being too low in the water. I fancied this steamboat belonged to the P.O. Company, which runs from Ceylon to Sydney, touching at King George's Point at Melbourne. At 5 o'clock in the evening, before that fleeting twilight which binds the night to day in tropical zones, Council and I were astonished by a curious spectacle. It was a shoal of Argonauts traveling along the surface of the ocean. We could count several hundreds. They belonged to the tubercle kind which are peculiar to the Indian seas. These great graceful mollusks moved back by means of their locomotive tube, through which they propelled the water already drawn in. Of their 8 tentacles, 6 were elongated and stretched out floating on the water, while the other 2, rolled up flat, were spread to the wind like a light sail. I saw their spiral-shaped and fluted shells, which Cuvier justly compares to an elegant skiff. A boat indeed, it bears the creatures which secretes it without its adhering to it. For nearly an hour the Nautilus floated in the midst of the shoal of mollusks. Then, I know not what the sudden fright they took, but as if that at signal every sail was furled, the arms folded, the body drawn in, the shells turned over, changing their center of gravity, and the whole fleet disappeared under the waves. Never did the ship of squadron maneuver with more unity. At that moment, night fell suddenly, and the reeds, scarcely raised by the breeze, lay peaceably under the sides of the Nautilus. The next day, 26th of January, we cut the equator at 82nd meridian and entered the northern hemisphere. During the day, a formidable troop of sharks accompanied us, terrible creatures, which multiply in these seas and make them very dangerous. They were Sestacio Philippi, sharks with brown backs and whitish bellies, armed with 11 rows of teeth-eyed sharks, their throat being marked with large black spots surrounded with eyes white like an eye. There were also some Isabella sharks with rounded snouts marked with dark spots. These powerful creatures often hurled themselves at the windows of the saloon with such violence as to make us feel very insecure. At such times Ned Land was no longer master of himself. He wanted to go to the surface and harpoon the monsters, particularly certain smooth, round-nosed sharks whose mouth is studded with teeth like a mosaic, and large tiger sharks nearly 6 yards long, the last named of which seemed to excite him more particularly. But the Nautilus, accelerating her speed, easily left the most rapid of them behind. The 27th of January. At the entrance of the vast Bay of Bengal, we met repeatedly a forbidding spectacle, dead bodies floating on the surface of the water. They were the dead of the Indian villages, carried by the Ganges to the level of the sea, and which the vultures, the only undertakers of the country, had not been able to devour, but the sharks did not fail to help them at their funeral work. About 7 o'clock in the evening, the Nautilus, half immersed, was sailing in a sea of milk. At first sight, the ocean seemed lactified. Was it the effect of the lunar rays? No, for the moon, scarcely 2 days old, was still laying hidden under the horizon in the rays of the sun. The whole sky, though lit by the sidereal rays, seemed black by contrast with the whiteness of the waters. Counsel could not believe his eyes, and questioned me as the cause of this strange phenomenon. Happily, I was able to answer him. It is called a milk sea, I explained. A large extent of white wavelets, often to be seen on the coasts of Amboina and in these parts of the sea. But, sir, said Counsel, can you tell what causes such an effect? For I suppose the water is not really turned into milk. No, my boy, and the whiteness which surprises you is caused only by the presence of myriads of infusoria, a sort of luminous little worm, gelatinous and without color, of the thickest thickness of hair, and whose length is not more than 7/1000th of an inch. These insects adhere to one another sometimes for several leagues. Several leagues, exclaimed Counsel. Yes, my boy, and you need not try to compute the number of these infusoria. You will not be able, for, if I am not mistaken, ships have floated on these milk seas for more than 40 miles. Toward midnight, the sea suddenly resumed its usual color, but behind us, even to its limits of the horizon, the sky reflected the whitened waves, and for a long time seemed impregnated with the vague glimmerings of an aurora borealis. Chapter 2. One moment, please. I've been a little dry. Chapter 2. A novel proposal of Captain Nemo's. On the 28th of February, when at noon the Nautilus came to the surface of the sea at 9 degrees 4 south longitude, there was land in sight about 8 miles to the westward. The first thing I noticed was a range of mountains about 2,000 feet high, the shapes of which were most capricious. On taking the bearings, I knew that we were nearing the island of Ceylon, the pearl which hangs from the lobe of the Indian peninsula. Captain Nemo and his second appeared at this moment. The captain glanced at the map, then, turning to me, said, "The island of Ceylon, noted for its pearl fisheries. Would you like to visit one of them, Monsieur Arnaud?" "Certainly, my captain." "Well, the thing is easy. Though if we see the fisheries, we shall not see the fishermen. The annual exportation has not yet begun. Never mind. I will give orders to make for the Gulf of Mannar, where we shall arrive in the night." The captain said something to his second, who immediately went out. Soon the Nautilus returned to her native element, and the manometer showed that she was about 30 feet deep. "Well, sir," said Captain Nemo, "you and your companions shall visit the bank of Manor, and if by chance some fisherman should be there, we shall see him at work." "Agreed, Captain." "By the by, Monsieur Arnaud, are you not afraid of sharks?" "Sharks!" exclaimed I. The question seemed a very hard one. "Well," continued Captain Nemo, "I admit, Captain, that I am not very familiar with that kind of fish." "We are accustomed to them," replied Captain Nemo, "and in time you will be too. However, we shall be armed, and on the road we may be able to hunt some of the tribe. It is interesting. So till tomorrow, sir, and early." This said, in a careless tone, Captain Nemo left the saloon. Now, if you were invited to hunt the bear in the mountains of Switzerland, what would you say? "Very well, tomorrow we go and hunt the bear." If you were asked to hunt the lion in the plains of the Atlas, or the tiger in the Indian jungles, what would you say? "Ha ha! It seems we are going to hunt the tiger or the lion." But when you are invited to hunt the shark in its natural element, you would perhaps reflect before accepting the invitation. As for myself, I paused my hand over my forehead, on which stood large drops of cold perspiration. "Let us reflect," said I, "and take our time. Hunting otters in a submarine forest, as we did in the island of Crespo, will pass, but going up and down at the bottom of the sea, where one of the almost certain to meet sharks, is quite another thing. I know well that in certain countries, particularly in the Andaman Islands, the people of color, the natives, never hesitate to attack them with a dagger in one hand and a running noose in the other. But I also know that few who affront those creatures ever return alive. However, I am not a native, and if I were, I think a little hesitation in this case would not be ill-timed." At this moment, Council and the Canadian entered quite composed and joyous. They knew not what awaited them. "Faith, sir," said Ned Land, "your Captain Nemo, the devil take him, has just made us a very pleasant offer." "Ah," said I, "you know." "If agreeable to you, sir," interrupted Council, "the commander of the Nautilus has invited us to visit the magnificent Selian fisheries tomorrow in your company. He did it kindly, and behaved like a real gentleman." "He said nothing more?" "Nothing more, sir, except that he had already spoken to you of this little walk." "Sir," said Council, "would you give us some detail of the pearl fishery?" "As to the fishing itself," I asked, "or to the incidents which—" "On the fishing," replied the Canadian, "before entering upon the ground. It is as well to know something about it." "Very well. Sit down, my friends, and I will teach you." Ned and Council seated themselves on an ottoman, and the first thing the Canadian asked was, "Sir, what is a pearl?" "My worthy Ned," I answered, "to the poet a pearl is a tear of the sea. To the Orientals it is a drop of the dew solidified. To the ladies it is the jewel of an oblong shape, of brilliancy of mother of pearl substance, which they wear their fingers, their necks, their ears. For the chemist it's the mixture of phosphate and carbonate of lime, with a little gelatin. And lastly, for naturalists, it is simply a morbid secretion of the organ that produces the mother of pearl among certain bivalves." "Branch of mollusca," said Council. "Class of Acephalai, order of the Tescatae." "Precisely so, my learned Council. And among these testici, the earshell, and the tridecane, and the turbots, in a word, all these which secrete mother of pearl, that is the bluish violet or white substance which lines the interior of their shells, are capable of producing pearls." "Mussels too?" asked the Canadian. "Yes, mussels of certain waters in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, and France. Good. For the future, I shall pay attention, replied the Canadian. But, I continued, the particular mollusk which secretes the pearl is the pearl oyster, the Meladrina margaritifera, that precious pintadine. The pearl is nothing but a nauseous formation deposited in a globular form, either adhering to the oyster shell or buried in the folds of the creature. On the shell it is fast, in the flesh it is loose, but always has a kernel, a small hard substance, maybe a barren egg, maybe a grain of sand, around which the pearly matter deposits itself year after year, successively, and by thin concentric layers. Are many pearls found in some oysters, in the same oysters? Asked Counsel. Yes, my boy. There are some pintadines, a perfect casket. One oyster has been mentioned, though I allow myself to doubt it, as having contained no less than 150 sharks. 150 sharks, claimed Ned Land. Did I say sharks? Said I hurriedly. I meant to say 150 pearls. Pearls, yes, pearls. Sharks would not be in the sense. Certainly not, said Counsel. But will you tell us by what means to extract these pearls? They proceed in various ways. When they adhere to the shell, the fishermen often pull them off with pincers, but the most common way is to lay the pintadines on mats of seaweed, which covers the banks. Thus, they die in the open air, and at the end of 10 days, there are in forward state of decomposition. They are then plunged into the large reservoirs of seawater. Then they are opened and washed again. Now begins the double work of the sorters. First, they separate the layers of pearls known in commerce by the name of bastard whites and bastard blacks, which are delivered in boxes of 250 and 300 pounds each. Then they take a parenechma of the oyster, boil it, and pass it through the sieve in order to extract the very smallest pearls. The price of these pearls varies according to their size, asked Counsel. Not only according to their size, I answered, but also according to their shape, their water, that is, their color, and their luster, that is, the bright and disappeared sparkle which make them so charming to the eye. The most beautiful are called virgin pearls, or pentagons. They are formed alone in the tissue of the mollusk, are white, often opaque, and sometimes have the transparency of an opal. They are generally round or oval. The round ones are made into bracelets, the oval into pendants, and, being more precious, are sold singly. Those adhering to the shell of the oyster are more irregular in shape, and are sold by weight. Lastly, in the lower order are classed those small pearls known under the name of seed pearls. They are sold by measure, and especially used in embroidery for church ornaments. But, said Counsel, is this pearl fishing dangerous? No, I answered quickly, particularly if certain precautions are taken. What does one risk in such a calling? Said Ned Land. The swallowing of some mouthfuls of sea-water? As you say, Ned. By the by, said I, trying to take Captain Nemo's careless tone, are you afraid of sharks, brave Ned? I, replied the Canadian, a harpooner by profession. It is my trade to make light of them. But, said I, it is not a question of fishing for them with an iron swivel, hoisting them into the vessel, cutting them off their tails with a blow of the chopper, ripping them up, and throwing their hearts into the sea. Then it is a question of, precisely, in the water, in the water. Faith, with a good harpoon, you know, sir, these sharks are ill-fashioned beasts. They must turn on their bellies to seize you, and in that time, Ned Land had a way of saying seize, which made my blood run cold. Well, And you, Counsel, what do you think of sharks? Me, said Counsel. I will be frank, sir. So much the better, thought I. If you, sir, mean to face the sharks, I do not see why your faithful servant should not face them with you. And I'm going to turn that down. Hello, Bonnie Twiss. Merlin, son of the Fae. Moggy. Thank you very much, Danlore. Teresa, hello. Good evening. Chapter 3. A pearl of 10 millions. The next morning, at 4 o'clock, I was awakened by a steward whom Captain Nemo had placed as my servant. I rose hurriedly, dressed, and went into the saloon. Captain Nemo was awaiting me. Monsieur Arnaud, said he, are you ready for the start? I am ready. Then please to follow me. And my companion, Captain? They have been told and are waiting. Are we not to put on our diver's dress? Asked I. Not yet. I have not allowed the Nautilus to come too near to this coast, and we are some distance from the Manar bank, but the boat is ready, and will take us to the exact point of disembarking, which will save a long way. It carries our diving apparatus, which we will put on when we begin our submarine journey. Captain Nemo conducted me to the central staircase, which led on the platform. Ned and Counsel were already there, delighted at the idea of the pleasure party which was preparing. 5 sailors from the Nautilus, with their oars, waited in the boat, which had been made fast against the side. The night was still dark. Layers of clouds covered the sky, allowing but few stars to be seen. I looked on the side where the land lay and saw nothing but a dark line enclosing 3 parts of the horizon. From southwest to northwest, the Nautilus, having returned during the night up the western coast of Céylon, was now west of the bay, or rather the Gulf, formed by the mainland and the island of Manar. There, under the dark waters, stretched the Pinditine bank, an inexhaustible field of pearls, the length of which is more than 20 miles. Captain Nemo, Ned Land, Counsel, and I took our places in the stern of the boat. The master went to the tiller, his 4 companions leaned on their oars. The painter was cast off, and we sheered off. The boat went toward the south. The oarsmen did not hurry. I noticed that their strokes, strong in the water, only allowed each other every 10 seconds, according to the method generally adopted in the Navy. While the craft was running by its own velocity, the liquid drops struck the dark depths of the waves crisply, like spats of melted lead. A little billow, spreading wide, gave a slight roll to the boat, and some samphire reeds flapped before it. We were silent. What was Captain Nemo thinking of? Perhaps of the land he was approaching, which he found too near to him, contrary to the Canadian's opinion, who thought it too far off. As to Counsel, he was merely there from curiosity. About 5:30, the first tints on the horizon showed the upper line of the coast more distinctly. Flat enough in the east, it rose little to the south. 5 miles still lay between us, and it was indistinct, owing to the midst of the water. At 6 o'clock, it became suddenly daylight with that rapidity peculiar to tropical regions, which know neither dawn nor twilight. The solar rays pierced the curtain of clouds piled up the eastern horizon, and the radiant orb rose rapidly. I saw land distinctly, with a few trees scattered here and there. The boat neared Manar Island, which was rounded to the south. Captain Nemo rose from his seat and watched the sea. At a sign from him with the anchor was dropped, but the chain scarcely ran, for it was little more than a yard deep, and this spot was one of the highest points of the bank of the Pindatines. "Here we are, Monsieur Arnaud," said Captain Nemo. "You see that enclosed bay? Here, in the month, will be assembled the numerous fishing boats of the exporters, and these are their waters their divers will ransack so boldly. Happily, this bay is well situated for that kind of fishing. It is sheltered from the strongest winds. Beg your pardon. One moment, please. I don't know if it's the fan, but I'm glad that I brought water down this evening. Now, where were we? Captain, you know how to pronounce the words. Where are we? Their waters, their divers will ransack so boldly. Happily, this bay is well situated for that kind of fishing. It is sheltered from the strongest winds. The sea is never very rough here, which makes it favorable for the divers' work. We will now put on our dresses and begin our walk." I did not answer, and while watching the suspected waves, began with the help of the sailors to put on my heavy sea dress. Captain Nemo and my companions were also dressing. None of the Nautilus men were to accompany us on this new excursion. Soon we were enveloped to the throat in india rubber clothing, the air apparatus fixed to our backs by braces. As to the Ruhmkorff apparatus, there was no necessity for it. Before putting my head into the copper cap, I had asked the question of the captain. "They would be useless," he replied. "We are going to no great depth, and the solar rays will be enough to light our walk. Besides, it would not be prudent to carry the electric light in these waters. Its brilliancy might attract some of the dangerous inhabitants of the coast, most inopportunely." As Captain Nemo pronounced these words, I turned to Council and Ned Land. But my two friends had already encased their heads in the metal cap, and they could neither hear nor answer. One last question remained to ask Captain Nemo. "And our arms?" asked I. "Our guns?" "Guns? What for? Do not mountaineers attack the bear with a dagger in their hand? And is not steel surer than lead? Here is strong blade. Put it in your belt, and we will start." I looked at my companions. They were armed like us, and, more than that, Ned Land was brandishing an enormous harpoon, which he had placed in the boat before leaving the Nautilus. Then, following the captain's example, I allowed myself to be dressed in the heavy copper helmet, and our reservoirs of air were at once in activity. An instant after, we were landed, one after the other, in about 2 feet of water upon an uneven sand. Captain Nemo made a sign with his hand, and we followed him by gentle declivity. We disappeared under the waves. Over our feet, like conveys of snipe in a bog, rose shoals of fish of the genus Montoptera, which have no other fins outside of their tails. I recognized the Javanese, a real serpent 2.5 feet long, of a vivid color underneath, and which might easily be mistaken for a conger eel if it was not for the golden stripes on its sides. In the genus of Stromateus, whose bodies are very flat and oval, I saw some of the most brilliant colors carrying their dorsal fin like a scythe. An excellent eating fish, which, dried and pickled, is known by the name of carawade. Then some tranquibars belonging to the genus Aspherides, whose body is covered with a shell, curious of 8 longitudinal plates. The heightening sun lit the mass of the waters more and more. The soil changed by degrees. To the fine sand succeeded the perfect causeway of boulders covered with a carpet of mollusks and zoophytes. Among the specimens of these branches, I noticed some plechnii with thin, unequal shells, a kind of ostratation peculiar to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Some orange lucani with rounded shells, rockfish 3 feet and a half long, which raised themselves under the waves like hands, ready to seize one. There were also panopries, slightly numinous, and lastly, some oculines like magnificent fans, forming one of the richest vegetations of these seas. In the midst of these living plants and under the arbors of the hydrophytes were layers of clumsy articules, particularly some ranulae, whose caprice formed a slightly rounded triangle, and some horrible-looking pathropones. At about 7 o'clock, we found ourselves at last surveying the oyster banks on which the pearl oysters are reproduced by millions. Captain Nemo pointed with his hand to the enormous heap of oysters, and I could well understand that this mine was inexhaustible, for nature's creative power is far beyond man's instinct of destruction. Ned Land, faithful to his instinct, hastened to fill a net which he carried by his side with some of the finest specimens. But he could not stop. We must follow the captain, who seemed to guide himself by paths known only to himself. The ground was sensibly rising, and sometimes on holding up my arm, it was above the surface of the sea. Then the level of the bank would sink capriciously. Would sink capriciously. Often we rounded high rocks, scarped into pyramids. In their dark fractures, huge crustacea, perched upon their high claws like some war machine, watched us with fixed eyes, and under our feet crawled various kinds of annelids. At this moment, there opened before us a large grotto, dug in picturesque heap of rocks, and carpeted with all the thick warp of the submarine flora. At first, it seemed very dark to me. The solar rays seemed to be extinguished by successive gradations, until its vague transparency became nothing more than drowned light. Captain Nemo entered. We followed. My eyes soon accustomed themselves to this relative state of darkness. I could distinguish the arches springing capriciously from natural pillars, standing broad upon their granite base, like the heavy columns of the Tuscan architecture. Why had our incomprehensible guide led us to the bottom of this submarine crypt? I was soon to know. After descending a rather sharp declivity, our feet trod the bottom of a kind of circular pit. There, Captain Nemo stopped, and with his hand indicated an object I had not yet perceived. It was an oyster of extraordinary dimensions, a gigantic tridecny, a goblet which could have contained a whole lake of holy water, a basin the breadth of which was more than 2.5 yards, and consequently larger than that slightly larger than that ornamenting the salon of the Nautilus. I approached this extraordinary mollusk. It adhered by its abyss to a table of granite, and there, isolated, it developed itself in the calm waters of the grotto. I estimated the weight of this tridacne at 600 pounds. Such an oyster would contain 30 pounds of meat, and one must have a stomach of gargantua to demolish some dozens of them. Captain Nemo was evidently acquainted with the existence of this bivalve and seemed to have particularly motive in verifying the actual state of his tridents. The shells were a little open. The captain came near and put his dagger between to prevent them from closing. Then, with his hand, he raised the membrane with its fringed edges, which formed the cloak of the creature. There, between the folds, plates, I saw a loose pearl, whose size equaled that of a coconut. Its globular shape, perfect clearness, and admirable luster made it altogether a jewel of inestimable value. Carried away by curiosity, I stretched out my hand to seize it, weigh it, and touch it, but the captain stopped me, made a sign of refusal, and quickly withdrew the dagger, and the two shells closed suddenly. I then understood Captain Nemo's intention. In leaving this pearl hidden in the mantle of the tridacne, he was allowing it to grow slowly. Each year, the secretions of the mollusk would add new concentric circles. I estimated its value at 500,000 pounds at least. After 10 minutes, Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. I thought he had halted previously to returning. No. By a gesture, he bade us crouch beside him in a deep fracture of the rock. His hand pointed to one part of the liquid mass, which I watched attentively. About 5 yards from me, a shadow appeared and sank to the ground. The disquieting idea of sharks shot through my mind, but I was mistaken, and once again it was not a monster of the ocean that we had anything to do with. It was a man, a living man, an Indian, a fisherman, a poor devil who, I suppose, had come to glean before the harvest. I could see the bottom of his canoe anchored some feet above his head. He dived and went up successively. A stone held between his feet, cut in the shape of a sugar loaf, while a rope fastened him to his boat, helped him to descend more rapidly. This was all his apparatus, reaching the bottom about 5 yards deep, and went on his knees and filled his bag with oysters picked up at random. Then he went up, emptied it, pulled up his stone, and began the operation once more, which lasted 30 seconds. The diver did not see us. The shadow of the rock hid us from sight. And how should this poor Indian ever dream that men, beings like himself, should be there under the water watching his movements, and losing no detail of the fishing? Several times he went up in this way and dived again. He did not carry away more than 10 at each plunge, for he was obliged to pull them from the bank to which they adhered by means of their strong biases. And how many of those oysters for which he risked his life had no pearl in them? I watched him closely. His maneuvers were regular, and for the space of half an hour no danger appeared to threaten him. I was beginning to accustom myself to the sight of his interesting fishing, when suddenly, as the Indian was on the ground, I saw him make a gesture of terror, rise, and make a spring to return to the surface of the sea. I understood his dread. A gigantic shadow appeared just above the unfortunate diver. It was a shark of enormous size, advancing diagonally, his eyes on fire, and his jaws open. I was mute with horror, and unable to move. The voracious creature shot toward the Indian, who threw himself on one side in order to avoid the shark's fins, but not its tail, for it struck his chest and stretched him on the ground. The scene lasted but a few seconds. The shark returned and, turning on his back, prepared himself for cutting the Indian in two, when I saw Captain Nemo rise suddenly, and then, dagger in hand, walked straight to the monster, ready to fight face to face with him. The very moment the shark was going to snap the unhappy fisherman in two, he perceived his new adversary and, turning over, made straight toward him. I can still see Captain Nemo's position. Holding himself well together, he waited for the shark with admirable coolness, and, when it rushed at him, threw himself on one side with wonderful quickness, avoiding the shock and burying his dagger deep into its side. But it was not all over. A terrible combat ensued. The shark had seemed to roar, it might say so. The blood rushed in torrents from its wound, the sea was dyed red, and through the opaque liquid, I could distinguish nothing more until the moment when, like lightning, I saw the undaunted captain hanging on to one of the creature's fins, struggling, as it were, hand to hand with the monster, and dealing successive blows to his enemy, yet still unable to give a decisive one. The shark's struggles agitated the water with such fury that the rocking threatened to upset me. I wanted to go to the captain's assistance, but nailed to the spot with horror, I could not stir. I saw the haggard eye. I saw the different phases of fight. The captain fell to the earth, upset by an enormous mass which leaned upon him. The shark's jaws opened wide like a pair of factory shears, and it would have been all over with the captain. But quick as thought, harpoon in hand, Ned Land rushed toward the shark and struck it with its sharp point. The waves were impregnated with a mass of blood. They rocked under the shark's movements, which beat them with indescribable fury. Ned Land had not missed his aim. It was a monster's death rattle. Struck to the heart, it struggled to dreadful convulsions, the shock of which overthrew counsel. But Ned Land had disentangled the captain, who, getting up without any wound, went straight to the Indian, quickly cut the cord which held him to the stone, took him in his arms, and, with a sharp blow of his heel, mounted to the surface. We all three followed in a few seconds, saved by a minuscule, and reached the fisherman's boat. Captain Nemo's first care was to recall the unfortunate man to life. I did not think he could succeed. I hoped so, for the poor creature's immersion was not long, but the blow from the shark's tail might have been his death blow. Happily, with the captain's and counsel's sharp friction, I saw consciousness return by degrees. He opened his eyes. What his surprise, his terror, even at seeing 4 great copper heads leaning over him, and, above all, what must have been thought when Captain Nemo, drawing from the pocket of his dress a bag of pearls, placed it in his hand. This magnificent charity from the man of waters to the poor Congolese was accepted with a trembling hand. His wondering eyes showed that he knew not to what superhuman beings he owed both fortune and life. At a sign from the captain, we regained the blank and, following the road already traversed, came in about half an hour to anchor which held the canoe of the Nautilus to the earth. Once on board, we each, with the help of the sailors, got rid of the heavy copper helmets. Captain Nemo's first word was to the Canadian. "Thank you, Master Land," said he. "It was the Revenge, Captain," replied Ned Land. "I owed you that." A ghastly smile passed across the captain's lips, and that was all. "To the Nautilus," said he. The boat flew over the waves. Some minutes after, we met the shark's dead body floating. By the black marking of extremity of its fins, I recognized the terrible Melanoptron of the Indian seas, the species of shark properly so called. It was more than 25 feet long. Its enormous mouth occupied 1/3 of its body. It was an adult. One moment, please. as was known by its 6 rows of teeth placed in isosceles triangles in the upper jaw. Counsel looked at it with scientific interest, and I am sure that he placed it, and not without reason, in the cartilaginous class of the Quadrataragon order with fixed gills, of the Selacian family, the genus of the sharks, While I was contemplating this inert mass, a dozen of these ferocious beasts appeared around the boat, and, without noticing us, threw themselves upon the dead body and fought with one another over the pieces. At 8:30, we were again on the board of the Nautilus. There I reflected of the incidents which had taken place in our excursion to the Manoir Bank. 2 conclusions I must inevitably draw from it. One, bearing upon the unparalleled courage of Captain Nemo, the other upon his devotion to a human being, a representative of that race from which he fled beneath the sea. Whatever he might say, this strange man had not yet succeeded in entirely crushing his heart. When I made this observation to him, he answered in a slightly moved tone, "That Indian, sir, is an inhabitant of an oppressed country, and I am still, and shall be, to my last breath, one of them." Captain Nemo, even though he is wanting to be away from people and wanting to be away from the torment and away from the torture and away from oppression, seems to be a man not given over to anger, a man who, no matter how cruel the world may be, can also be very kind. Hello, Lauren, my brother. Good to see you. Amanda, thank you so much. The Sixth Sense, good evening. Teresa Hare, good evening. Bonnie Twist, good evening. Merlin, Son of the Fae, hello. Vicky, hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining me this week. I apologize for the stiffness of my throat. Richard Goulet, thank you very much. I appreciate you all so very much. Thank you for the likes, the comments, the shares. Thank you for all of those who support me. I'm going to start listing those who do. I have to rework so much stuff, but that's in the works too. So lots of things I have to get done. Anyway, my darlings, I appreciate you. Thank you for joining me tonight, and I shall see you next week. And then before too long, we'll be seeing you for Scared and Alone, and then you'll be seeing me for some other things too. So with that, my loves, good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are. Thank you for joining me. Good night.